A lot of people on both the left and right are debating the question of whether the rise of Donald Trump is in part explained by racism or by economic anxiety, particularly among a certain group of white men. Now, if I read him correctly, but he'll tell us, our next guest says the answer to the racism or economic anxiety question is yes. But he will clarify that for us. Tim Carney is a senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which, as many of you know, may not be entirely politically aligned with my own views in general. However, he is also the author of The Big Ripoff, How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money. I see what you did there with that title. Tim, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, I want to commend you for tackling this subject, which a lot of people are on the left. I think it's a topic of some debate, some about what's underlying, for lack of a better term, the Trump phenomenon. Is it racism or economics? And on the right, I feel as if a lot of your colleagues on the right are kind of ducking the question altogether, and I think it's to your credit that you kind of take it on. So first off, did I misrepresent your position? You said economic anxiety is racial anxiety. Understanding Trump was the title of the heading they gave to your column on this at the Examiner. Did I oversimplify your position?
No, I think that's about right, and I don't know, what portion to chalk up to racism as opposed to sort of, racial status anxiety. You could use part of the word, but what I would say is you can't understand Trump without thinking about economic anxiety among working class whites, and you can't think about economic anxiety among working class whites without thinking about the history and the present status of racism in America. And one of the ways I sort of summarize it, a bit cynically, but I don't think necessarily wrong, and a bit uncharitably, is to say that the lots of things in American society rigged the game in favor of low-skilled white males, and that the game is becoming a little bit less rigged, thus making things relatively harder for low-skilled white males.
Well, I might also add to that a lot of things, it's interesting how you want to frame this. I might say that a lot of things have been done in the last 2 or 3 decades that have also rigged the scale against lower income people of either race. And that means that when people experience economic anxiety. Listen, I think you and I talked about this once before. I'm from Utica, New York. I'm from a working class town, Rust Belt town, that now whole sections of it look like they've been bombed out. It looks like Paris or London after the Blitz. So, I get that people see their way of life disappearing around them, and that when they see their way of life disappearing, that creates fear and anxiety, and then they want to lash out. They're looking for a target. So what do you say to the argument that says, well, this is really big business and big corporations kind of in concert with politicians, frankly, some in both parties, who will do their bidding, that have screwed the American worker, and these people are mistakenly taking it out on folks of other ethnicities. What do you think of that shorthand description?
To some extent that's happening, but I think that if you see it that way, you are seeing it not incorrectly. But I think the best way to start is to look at the kind of broad constellation of what's happening and what are contributing factors. So wages for people in the U.S. with no college degree have flattened or fallen over the last 20 years or so, while if you have an advanced degree, they're going up. Some of the numbers I cite in the piece are white women have seen the best increase in wages. Hispanics have, black women have, black men have seen their wages go down since 2000. But that you've got sort of different parts of the economy kind of diverging. People with more education have always made more, but things were closer together. So when we talk about inequality, what we're talking about largely is that everybody's sort of been going up, and the low-skilled people have flattened off and stopped going up. By low-skilled, I mean, you have a high school degree, maybe went to college, maybe you probably didn't go to college at all, you certainly don't have a degree. And that flattening, why is it happening? One aspect is international trade has become a lot bigger deal, so there's a lot less manufacturing in the U.S., but also, frankly, a lot of domestic manufacturing is still here. It's just being done by robots. I mean, Boeing's new factory is mostly robots, and so that's a huge thing. So these factory jobs go away.
Although, let me stop you for a second there, Tim Carney of the Washington Examiner. While I agree that robots are a concern going forward, if we were really, we'll get a little nerdy here because I know you get into that stuff too. If robots were really taking away a lot of jobs, you'd think we'd see a rise in productivity, but that's dramatic over the years, and we're not seeing that lately. So if robots are doing such great stuff here in the U.S., why isn't productivity going up more than it is?
Yeah, I mean, if you look over a couple decades, there is a significant improvement in productivity data of the average American worker, and of course, the downside of increased productivity in average American worker means they need fewer people to do the same work. And in the short term, I haven't looked at those numbers, but I do know that over the course of 25 years, there is a boost in productivity. And so one way I tell the story, and it's a broad sweep, so it won't be precise, is that free trade did help send these jobs overseas, but if somehow you forced companies to manufacture stuff here, that wouldn't bring the jobs back in large part because of automation. And then the other complaint you get from Trump people is that immigrants are taking their jobs. And to some degree, this isn't true because, well, frankly, we're a country of immigrants. I'm sure my great-grandfather came from Ireland and took somebody's job, and that's sort of part of the labor market competition. And another part because a lot of the jobs, a lot of immigrants come over and start their own businesses, and what's the net effect? It's hard to complain about the local dry cleaner who's an immigrant. He's not taking anybody's job. He's starting his own business.
It's funny you should mention that.
There is, when you increase the supply of labor, you're going to decrease the price. That is something that happens. And so those complaints that immigration and international trade are hurting their wages, you can't blow those off because those are grounded in economic reality.
Okay, but let me push back on that second one a little bit. Now, I think, first of all, glad you mentioned dry cleaning because my grandfather came to this country and opened a tailor shop and did dry cleaning, but that's anecdotal. So he was a small businessman and an immigrant, as many are, but more broadly, the studies I've seen show that immigration contributes to growth and ultimately to jobs and wage strengthening, not weakening. But even if we leave that aside, there is one element here that you left out, Tim Carney, and that is the growing wealth inequality. In 1965, the average CEO made 20 times as much as the average worker. Today, it's 331 times as much, depending on which study you look at. It's hundreds of times as much, and that extends to, much more of our national income goes to financialization, to the handling of money rather than the production of goods and so on. All of these things, there are multiple factors, but they can all be wrapped up in the kind of overall category of inequality, wealth inequality, and income inequality. And, you come at this from a conservative side, I come at it from a leftier side, but what do we do about that?
Yeah, so what do we do about it is part of being a conservative is I'm a guy who's has a lot easier time pointing out the problems and coming up with the solutions. But what I sort of explain in this sort of subtext of my economic anxiety, racial anxiety piece is that the increasing equality along some axes are making things worse for some people. So in other words, it's easier for women to get sort of executive jobs than it used to be. It's easier for Hispanics to get hired than it used to be. It's a lot easier for black women to make decent money than it used to be. But what a lot of that does is it comes at the expense of people who previously didn't have to compete with all those folks. And a lot of that is the Trump voting low-skilled white male, but some of it is, it also includes working class blacks and Hispanics. But the fact is that an increased inequality in some ways exacerbates inequality in others, and this is true when you look at domestic versus international. A lot of what is making things harder for working class people here is the stuff that's bringing jobs overseas and, allowing places like India and China to finally get a middle class. And so what you see is the messiness of this all, that helping one group often ends up hurting another group. So I'm not going to have an answer for how to solve increasing inequality, but I am going to say we got to make sure we look at it in the context of the complexity here. Again, low-skilled white males were being subsidized in a variety of ways, and that subsidy is being shrunk, and they are seeing their lot in life either get worse or at least get worse relative to the rest of the people around them.
Well, I think I do have solutions. That's one of the advantages of being on the left, but I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. But we're talking with Timothy Carney of the Washington Examiner. I got several. You'll probably hate them all, but one of them is, look, when we look at the data, we show that when the private sector workforce was more heavily unionized, it was more able to bargain for higher wages, better benefits. That translated into, new study shows that translated into benefits for non-union workers as well, because the bosses who didn't want to see their workplaces unionized gave better benefits to lower the demand for a union, and so on. So one solution is, let's encourage union growth.
Yeah, and I think you've got to, unions is a tricky thing because they're propped up by some regulations and restrained by other sort of privileges given to businesses. So it is a complicated thing. There has been a history of racism in unions, is something you've got to realize. And to some extent, again, I'm not trying to say this makes unions bad. This is part of the complicated thing. One of the ways unions kept wages high was by keeping out competitors. And one of the ways in some industries, in some parts of the country, that manifested itself was white people making sure that minorities or immigrants were kept out of the job. So can you have unions be protected without them being racist? Yeah, obviously unions these days are actively, the national leadership of them is actively trying to root out and apologize for sort of past histories of racism. But just sort of to reemphasize the complexity of it all, one way that you kept, when they were paying $22 an hour at a GE factory in Bloomington, Indiana, what was making the wages worth that much? Was it just collective bargaining? I think it was collective bargaining combined with some level of trade protection and combined with some level of sort of labor protectionism, where some people, sort of insiders, were given tracks to these good jobs and outsiders were kept out.
Yeah, well, first of all, as far as, unions' racial history, nobody wants to cover that up, but I think it's a minor and certainly a huge issue, but and I remember, by the way, when unions were conservative, I remember marching against the war in Vietnam and getting beaten up by union guys, and my father was a union guy, but but the point is that, on a global level, when you have an organized workforce, and obviously you want to execute it in a non-racist and inclusive way, everybody does better. So then the question is, how many of those other solutions can we point to? We're going to probably run out of time at this. I guess I would say on the global level, Tim, my biggest, I agree with much of what you say, as I often do, but my biggest disagreement with you is that I think you're isolating a couple factors maybe and making them look bigger than they are, like the racism or the exclusionaryism. And I've got nothing wrong with a trade policy that says, you got to, let's bring the jobs back home. I've got nothing wrong with an industrial policy for this country. I got nothing wrong with a pro-union policy. So my answer to those white guys would be, who are backing Trump, is, look, we know the system is rigged against you, but don't take it out on foreigners or people with dark skin. Unrig the system economically so that it works for everybody.
Well, and now I'll just add one place where another place I agree with that. Another place where I think we would agree is I often point to sort of aspects of the government that rig the game in favor of the wealthy, not problems with the market that do it, but government policies, whether you've got eminent domain or complex regulation that then the big companies hire the lobbyists to help them out with, et cetera. That the game is rigged, and I long was telling Republicans, agree with Elizabeth Warren on that and point out the ways in which government is rigging the game against a regular guy and in favor of the guy who can afford the lobbyist. Of course, Republicans didn't listen. Mitt Romney famously said, if you're in the bottom 47%, you don't get to join our country club. And then the easiest way to tap into populist fervor, the easiest way, is through sort of demagoguery and scapegoating, and that's what we've gotten in 2016.
Yeah, that's a lot we can agree on, so we'll have to leave it there. Timothy Carney, columnist for the Washington Examiner. As always, good to talk to you.
Thank you. You too.